next, CityNet 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is made possible in part by TCI and is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Good afternoon. I'm Frances Storrs, President of the City Club, and I want to welcome you to another outstanding program and welcome also our live television audience on CityNet 30. I'm also happy to report that beginning next week, City Club's program will be live each week on Great Talk 1150 AM radio. We are delighted to have the immediacy of the live broadcast available to our listeners once again. Today, we will focus on the roles and challenges facing the Oregon National Guard, especially in this time of uncertainty in Iraq. Major General Raymond F. Rees, Adjutant General of the Oregon National Guard, is here to share his perspective with us. I do have a couple of announcements. Next Friday, March 27th, please join us for the first major address from Daniel Bernstein, new president of Portland State University. He will describe his vision for the future of Portland State, and again, we will be here at the Multnomah Club. On Thursday, March 26th, the first program in a series of 4 science breakfast programs sponsored by the Business and High-Tech Issue Committee will feature Don Wolf, professor and senior scientist at the Oregon Regional Primate Center. The subject of the day will be cloning from fantasy to fact. And the place is the Benson Hotel Cambridge Room for breakfast, 7:30 in the morning. Reservations are required, and they may be made through Winnie Kane at the City Club office. Sounds like an amazing program. Our board host today is Jay Formick, second vice president of the club and co-chair of the research board, sitting here at the head table. He's also executive director of Oregon Heat, and he will ask the first question of our speaker. Following Jay's question, we will open the program to questions from other City Club members in the audience, and please line up behind the microphone and ask your question, brief, we hope, to the speaker so that we can have as many questions as possible from City Club members. Broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part because of corporate underwriting from Fred Meyer, Washington Mutual Savings Bank, and Stoll Reeves, and we are indeed grateful for their support. As I introduce today's speaker to you, I am standing as erect as I possibly can. Major General Raymond F. Rees, the Adjutant General of the Oregon National Guard, has a most impressive set of credentials. He was born in Pendleton and was commissioned a second lieutenant at the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1966. He was assigned to the 101st Airborne Division in Vietnam, where his service resulted in numerous decorations, including the Republic of Vietnam Gallantry Cross with Palm. Major General Rees is also a University of Oregon Law School graduate, and he practiced law in Pendleton until 1978. In 1973, he had joined the Army Reserve and then the Army National Guard. While increasing his military training, he also worked actively as a managing partner of Rees Farms in Helix, Oregon, and simultaneously commanded a National Guard cavalry regiment in Idaho. In 1987, Governor Goldschmidt asked him to become Oregon's 22nd Adjutant General. He left Oregon for several years to serve in Washington as director of the Army National Guard Bureau and as vice chief and as active chief of the National Guard Bureau, the nation's National Guard. Meanwhile, he had been promoted to Major General of the line. In 1994, Governor Roberts asked him to return to Oregon as our adjutant general. Now, I hope you are following these simultaneous threads that have created the fabric of this really remarkable career. In addition to numerous military organizations, Major General Rees is also a member of Oregon State Bar and is a member of the Board of Directors of the Governor's Drug and Violence Crime Policy Board. His military decorations include the Bronze Star, the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, and so many others I couldn't begin to list them for you. All I can tell you is if they were all worn simultaneously, a fall into the ocean would be his last event. General Rees and his wife have 3 children. 2 are grown and 1 is in high school. They live in Clackamas, and it is indeed an honor for me to welcome, in your behalf, Major General Rees today to tell us about Oregon's National Guard and some of the challenges that Oregon members of the National Guard are now facing. Please welcome Major General Rees.
Well, thank you, Francis. That was a wonderful introduction, and I promise I won't go swimming in uniform. I wouldn't want to create a problem for the Coast Guard. It's wonderful to see a lot of familiar faces here in this audience today, and certainly an honor to be before the City Club and to be able to talk about one of my favorite subjects, the National Guard. This is I'd like to just take a moment here to say that I think my appearance is timely, because I know that many of you, whether you're reading the Oregonian or you are listening to the broadcast media here in Portland area, are quite aware of the recent deployment of the 142nd Fighter Wing of the Oregon Air National Guard to Incirlik, Turkey, to conduct what's known as Operation Northern Watch. And I will discuss that in some detail later. But before I get into that, let me just share what I think is a little humorous story that occurred during the 142nd's deployment ceremony. I was in the course of introducing Governor Kitzhaber, and I took great pains to elaborate on the history of volunteerism in the Oregon National Guard, from the first 550 individuals who volunteered back in 1847, 150 years ago, to the 1,200 who volunteered in 1898, 100 years ago, to the present, in the 142nd, the 400 volunteers who were deploying to Incirlik. And afterwards, I was asked by a member of the media to expand on the volunteer nature of the deployment and to explain why these officers and airmen were not being paid. Well, I realized one more time that, number one, I am not the world's greatest communicator, and number two, that there must be a lot of people out there who've never heard of the draft or selective service. So, what I want to do then is touch a little bit on history here about the National Guard and the militia, and tie that into the current situation. If you go back in history, there are 3 states and 1 territory out there that are vying for the title of who has the oldest militia and the oldest National Guard. And that's Puerto Rico, Florida, New Mexico, and Massachusetts. And Jay and I were talking about Massachusetts here prior to this, and he'll be pleased to know that officially we recognize Massachusetts as having the oldest National Guard. 361 years ago, in 1636, the first regiments were formed, and essentially those regiments have been in continuous service, serving America ever since. Now, those citizen soldiers and those Massachusetts regiments and the others that were in the 13 original colonies were the heart and soul of the Continental Army. In fact, it was the citizen soldiers at Lexington and Concord that fired the shots that were heard around the world. And for those of you that have a connection with the regular services, I'm pleased to point out that the inscription on the monument there that has to do with Paul Revere, it does not say the British are coming, because everybody was a British citizen at that point in time. It says the regulars are coming. So that's just, again, I hope that somebody can realize the humor in some of these comments here. So after the American people had successfully forged a new nation in the heat of battle, the Founding Fathers recognized the unique role of the militia by mandating its role in the Constitution itself. The Constitution of the United States states that a well-regulated militia is necessary for the security of a free state. And as I'll get into a little later in my speech, there are more reasons for that than are obvious. And be that as it may, the militia continued in one form or another throughout the 19th century, and with few aspects of the well-regulated militia that we certainly currently enjoy, but certainly entwined with every armed clash and conflict that occurred in the 19th century. Here in Oregon, our militia dates back to 1847. I believe the brochure that you've got here with this particular program says 1844. It was mentioned in the provisional government's constitution, but the actual first call-up was in 1847 when territorial volunteers responded to the calamity of what became known as the Whitman Massacre. In fact, this is the sesquicentennial period of that particular event. On February 24th, 150 years ago, there was the first battle that took place, the Battle of Sand Hollow, which was just south and east of what is currently Boardman in eastern Oregon. If you contemplate that particular point in time and you think about it, there were only roughly 9,000 settlers in the Willamette Valley at that point in time. And out of that 9,000, men, women, and children, 550 men responded to the call and joined this particular expedition to eastern Oregon, what we know now as southeastern Washington, to bring justice to the troubled region. And they left farms and families behind during that time, and it was not all that clear if the natives on the west side of the Cascades would remain passive. That commitment to protect our communities has been a hallmark of the National Guard ever since. If we go on through the 19th century, whether it's the Cayuse or the Yakima War, service when the regular troops left for the Civil War, the Bannock-Paiute War, or other events, the militia or the National Guard had a role in each of those. But the true changing point for the National Guard was the Spanish-American War. And this may be the sesquicentennial of the Whitman Massacre, but this is the centennial of the Spanish-American War. 100 years ago, February 1898, the Maine was sunk in Havana Harbor, and then the events unraveled from there. And certainly as far as Oregon is concerned, and particularly here in Portland, all you have to do is walk down to the park blocks and see a statue of Theodore Roosevelt, go down in front of the Justice Building and see a statue honoring the 2nd Oregon Volunteers, or go down to the waterfront and see the mast of the battleship Maine. You will know that this was a very significant event to this state as well as to the nation. In the 2 decades prior to that particular conflict, the National Guards all around the United States began to reflect on the influence of soldiers schooled in the hard knocks of the Civil War, and a great revitalization of the National Guard took place at that time across the country. And in fact, there was a Civil War veteran here in Portland who had been a drummer boy in the Civil War. His name was Owen Summers. He came to Portland, became a businessman, and eventually a state legislator. And in 1887, he enacted what became known as the Summers Act, which created the modern National Guard in Oregon. He was the regimental commander of the 2nd Oregon Volunteer Infantry that went to Guam and to the Philippines in 1898. That 2nd Oregon Volunteer Regiment, 1,200 volunteers, produced 4 Congressional Medal of Honor winners, and Summers himself was promoted to Brevet Brigadier General. They seized Guam, and that particular regiment was there to accept the surrender of the Spanish garrison in Manila. It was the success and the failure of the National Guard effort during that particular war that led to some little-known legislation, except to those of us who are really into this, known as the Dick Act of 1903, that really dramatically changed the role of the National Guard in the 20th century. And the role that we play today and the role that we played throughout the 20th century comes directly from that. Citizen soldiers of the National Guard then have played a role in every conflict down through the 20th century. And Oregon's 41st Division certainly served a prominent role in France in World War I, and the Southwest Pacific and the Philippines in World War II. If we look at the one war that I think all of us would openly and freely admit that we lost, that was Vietnam, and we look into that war, we would see that there was a dramatic change in the way that the National Guard was approached or failed to be approached at that point in time. Whether it was fear of a greater conflict with Russia or it was a lack of political will, the Guard was not called, and the rest is history. Now, maybe the Department of Defense also has come to the same conclusion here that I'm trying to draw, because it wasn't long after the end of that war that the Secretary of Defense, Melvin Laird, developed a total force policy. And that policy boils down to the fact that the active and reserve components of all of our military need to be included in all war planning and execution. And it has been that way since 1973. Since then, the Army and the Air Force in particular have had a very close relationship with the National Guard. The great success of Desert Storm proved that our founding fathers had it right. When the citizen soldier goes to war, America goes to war. The constitutional concept that I'm talking about is really one of accountability. In a great democracy, the defense of the nation should not be left to some Praetorian Guard that is only accountable to the emperor. When your local National Guard unit leaves town, it takes your neighbors, your sons and daughters, the visible, living treasure of the United States, a fact that cannot be ignored. And it takes with it the commitment of the people of the United States to prosecute the war or the action to a successful and a quick conclusion. Personally, I cannot tell you the full and emotional impact that I felt as a Vietnam veteran at the significance of knowing that our Congress actually debated the merits and voted to support the actions initiated in the Persian Gulf. I believe that debate was driven by the call-up of the National Guard and reserve units compelling the Congress to make a decision. Now, 10 years after, we are now making more changes in our relationship based on this bedrock element of our Constitution. Currently, America is faced with two stark truths concerning its armed forces. The first is economic. The American public feels, and rightly so, it is important to balance the federal budget, and the Congress is responding. The Cold War is over, and people want to know, where is their peace dividend? This means a much smaller defense force structure and less money for the structure that remains. Less money, whether that's in actual dollars or real dollars, that's going to happen. The second is truth or reality is geopolitical. By anyone's analysis, fortunately, out there is no pure conventional military threat on the horizon, and none are forecast. Unfortunately, there is an increased demand for military forces to serve in peacekeeping and other types of operations such as Bosnia, Somalia, Haiti, and Zaire, to name just a few. And America is now increasingly vulnerable to unconventional threats and what the military calls asynchronous warfare. If an enemy cannot match us on the battlefield, then they will look for the place that we are weak, and what everybody is predicting is that we are weak at home, that terrorism will be something that enemies will choose to inflict upon the United States in the future. When one looks at these two new realities, one realizes right away that there is only one solution to this conundrum of increased use of the military with fewer resources. That solution is an increased reliance upon the National Guard and Reserve. When you look at the plain economics of this, we're talking about a force that's on a retainer that's basically there at 25% to 30% of the cost of the active duty force. Fortunately, the military has been evolving in this direction for some time, and this is especially true of the Air National Guard. Of the 1,100 aircraft or so that are in the Air National Guard of the United States, nearly 400 are deployed every day of the year in some way in support of our national interests. We are truly, in the Air National Guard, returning to the militia concept, the idea that the Minuteman is there ready to respond to any event that comes upon the nation. And the Air Force is using this dramatically. They are primarily using a combination of training opportunities and volunteerism to sustain these efforts. and they are very good at actually budgeting and planning for widespread use of the Air National Guard and the Air Force Reserve in a routine fashion. On the other hand, the Army has followed a more familiar 20th century pattern of using what we call involuntary call-ups under Presidential Selected Reserve Call-Up Authority. Most recently, in the Oregon Army National Guard, we have deployed 2 units, the 41st Personnel Services Company out of Salem and the 82nd Rear Tactical Operations Center out of Lake Oswego to support Operation Joint Endeavor and Joint Guard in Bosnia. And in fact, the commander of the Lake Oswego unit is Colonel Dennis Merrill, who is also a captain in the Portland Police Department. And I'm proud to tell you that both of these units, one went in 96, the other in 97, they did a fantastic job and returned, and I'm sure every Oregonian would be very proud of their service. But I think of most significance to this particular audience at this point in time is this recent deployment of the 142nd Fighter Wing from the Portland Air National Guard base. It is deployed to Incirlik, Turkey. It is there right now serving and conducting Operation Northern Watch. And let me just read to you this particular update that was given to me this morning. First of all, to explain what Northern Watch is, it's a combined military operation with the U.S., British, and Turkish governments. It's authorized as part of a resolution by the United Nations to restrict the use of force by Iraq against its Kurdish minority. The Iraqi Kurds were persecuted as a result of an uprising against Iraqi authorities in the aftermath of the Gulf War. Northern Watch is a follow-on operation replacing Operation Provide Comfort, which began in April 1991. Northern Watch began in January 1997, and the U.S. European Command, along with these coalition partners, conducts air operations over Iraq to enforce the no-fly zone north of 36 degrees latitude. This is done to conduct surveillance and monitoring of the Iraqi government's military forces in the region. The 142nd is meeting this challenge. It is enforcing the no-fly zone. Our people are over there, they're working 14 to 18-hour days. They have flown 100% of the required sorties, and every mission is tailored by the Combined Task Force Commander with about 18 hours of actual flying operations built into each and every day, sunrise to sunset and beyond. And it takes the F-15s a little less than an hour from their deployed location in Incirlik to the Iraqi border. And then each of the missions lasts about 6 hours. Now, if you get tired flying from here to the East Coast in 4 or 5 hours, think what these people are doing if they're up in the air in the cockpit of a fighter plane for 6 hours. I'm sure there's some excitement that goes along with that to keep their attention on the task. Given the current diplomatic situation, the 142nd will not likely see combat operations. But I think this deployment is an example of the Air Force's long-term commitment to the use of the Air National Guard. It was planned well over a year ago and built with the understanding that this was a quote-unquote volunteer rotation with minimum impact on airmen and their employers and their families, and in some respects their communities. 3 two-week rotations, 400 officers and airmen in, out, and home. The coincidence that their deployment took place, and I want to underline coincidence, that this deployment took place at the same time as the recent dust-up with Saddam, brings into play the issue of accountability. I am sure that each of you in this room have had some thoughts upon seeing these pictures in the front page of the Oregonian or seeing this on your television about why is the 142nd going to Incirlik, Turkey. Am I for or against this? How much is this going to cost? Is our Oregon unit prepared and qualified? And I ask you, would you have cared as much, or would you have just shrugged your shoulders if it had been the active duty F-15 unit that departed from Langley Air Force Base in Virginia? I tell you that this is about accountability, and that if we are going to, as a democracy, pay attention to these things and about where our money is spent and the living treasure of our sons and daughters, then we need to pay attention to this as it transpires. We have another unit that just departed yesterday, the 270th Air Traffic Control Squadron, that's going to Tazar, Hungary. It is being called under the Presidential Selected Reserve call-up. It will be gone 5 months. It's a small unit, but it has a big impact on each of those individuals and their families and their employers. A reminder again to all of us that we are involved in Bosnia, that there is a cost, an impact on people's time and the national treasury. A reminder to keep evaluating our role. Is it necessary? Is it successful? Is it the right thing? So as you can see, the National Guard is increasingly involved in more than just 2 weeks a year and 1 weekend a month. The National Guard is very much an active partner in the national security strategy. Given the world situation and budgetary needs, you are likely to see an increase in these trends. I mentioned toward the beginning of this speech that the Founding Fathers felt that a well-regulated militia was essential to the security of the state. I believe in that too. And I am amazed every day at the brilliance of the people who wrote the Constitution. I believe it because it is more economic and efficient than maintaining a large standing military. I believe it because I see every day that there are a lot of people, wonderful citizen soldiers, that are represented, some here in this room and others that I have known for many years, that are competent and proud to serve our state and nation. In fact, the individual who got me to come in and give this speech today, Fred Rosenbaum, who should be here but he's in Hawaii, is another great example of an individual, a member of this club, who gives an awful lot to the community. And there are many more that you know, and I can, let me name another Air Guard member who is certainly significant to this state, a retired General Officer, our Chief Justice Wally Carson. But most importantly to me and the Founding Fathers, it is an institution that promotes community and civil involvement in the nation's affairs and accountability in a great democracy. A National Guard of the people, by the people, and for the people. Thank you very much for listening to me today.
Thank you, Major General Rees. That was a very insightful invocation of Oregon's involvement throughout history in major conflicts of the nation. You've succeeded in tying Oregonians into the history of the nation through the National Guard, which is a significant player. I have a couple of questions, and unfortunately, being the first one to ask, I only get to ask one. Perhaps I'll come back a little bit later. Is there any likelihood that the total force policy instituted in 1973 will ever be revoked? It seems to me as though General Colin Powell's overwhelming force doctrine would suggest it never will be. But one can never tell with the vagaries of politics in Washington, D.C. If you could share with us what your take on that prospect is, I would appreciate it.
Thank you. I certainly do not believe it will be revoked. In fact, I think that everyone that I know in the Department of Defense and even the people in the Congress are looking at ways to reinforce the total force policy, meaning a better integration of the Guard and Reserve into our military structure. And in fact, it goes back to the comments that I made earlier about economic necessity of getting this done, that you have to, when you look out at how are we going to get this done with fewer dollars and meet the commitments of the country, then we need to look at the most economic way to do this. I think there are a lot of individuals. I know that Francis and I were talking here earlier about Senator Hatfield, and I don't presume to speak for Senator Hatfield, but I know from many years of visiting with him that his concerns for peace and for accountability, that they want to see a strong role for the National Guard. And so I think there are people on both sides of the aisle, whether they be hawks or doves, that want to see that the role of the Guard continue and to be a fundamental part of the total force.
Hi, I'm Leslie Hildul. I'm a member of the club. It was an interesting experience listening to your speech because I had objections to much of what you said, and yet I found that I agreed with your conclusions, and you persuaded me, and I thank you. I learned something today. I wanted to throw you a hot potato because I value your opinion, and I hope you don't duck it because I know it's maybe a tough one. Are gun-bearing citizens necessary to the safety of our country? And I mean, not just professionals. I mean all citizens.
All right. No, I don't intend to duck it. I think that's a very difficult question to try to scope. I would put it this way. As long as there are the Saddam Husseins of the world, people who are bad actors, whether it is the police on the streets of Portland or it is the armed forces that are necessary around the world to protect the peace, I think it is necessary to have individuals who are capable of bearing arms. Now, I realize I can get off into the National Rifle Association's arguments here and so on, but I won't choose to do that. I think there is another aspect of this that has to do with service and learning to respect arms that I think we fail to realize sometimes, that when we if youngsters, for instance, only see the Bruce Willises and others in the motion pictures who are using weapons, and they have no idea about the real life consequences of the use of weapons and the discipline necessary to prevent harm to themselves and to their fellow soldiers or those who serve in the military, then we separate fact from fiction. And I would much rather have a youngster learn about weapons in the military, the proper use of them, the discipline, and I'll use the term, the fear of them, than I would to have them take it off of TV and go down and conduct a drive-by shooting or something like that.
My name is Pete Heuser. I'm a City Club member. I recognize that you're an advocate of the National Guard, and that's great. And I was going to ask you a question: how much less expensive is it to maintain a soldier in the National Guard? And you say it's 25 to 30% of that to maintain a regular soldier. Given that, and of course the need to make things in government service as efficient as possible, what's to prevent us from dramatically cutting the regular Army, cutting by another 30-40% and increasing the involvement and size and funding of the National Guard, if that seems to be the more efficient way to go?
I think that's a very good question. Certainly, this has been required in law that every 4 years they have what's called a quadrennial review. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of Defense have to justify to the Congress through their description of the national military strategy why we need a certain size force out there and why we are going to spend the nation's treasure on that particular force. I think this goes back to part of Jay's question about General Powell's description of this massive force that we need to have and that we're going to be able to rush out and crush any particular enemy that raises their head out there. I alluded to this earlier, in which I said that our analysis truly shows that for the next 10 to 15 years, there is no forecast peer competitor for the United States. Now, you can take one side of this argument, which says the three reasons that we have a military are to deter our enemies. Don't anybody raise your head or even think about becoming a peer competitor, or to reassure our allies that we can do what is necessary to support our allies, or three, that we can compel and shape the situation to the vital interests of the United States, whatever it may be. On the other side, there is this business of, is this not having too much of a fire department, too much of a police department? Can't we do this more economically? We may all agree that these are three particular purposes that we should be able to do, but can't we do it through diplomacy, through better means to get the job done? So there is this debate that goes on every 4 years. Currently, they have just come out with this, with really an endorsement of General Powell's policy, and they're going to continue on with this. There are those of us who feel strongly that the Guard could play a greater role, and that if we look at life cycle costs of what it takes to maintain a Guard soldier versus an active duty soldier, that perhaps the savings that you're talking about are there, and that we should should look at increasing the role of the Guard, as I've suggested in my speech today.
John Leeper, City Club member.
Yes, sir.
General, 2 questions for you. I don't feel inhibited like Jay. For the extended deployments and call-up of reserve components, what impact does that have on the morale of the unit and the individual? And the second question is, what does that do to your enlistment and retention rates?
All right, those are very good questions and ones that we pay a lot of attention to. I go back to this business of volunteerism. I personally believe that a lot of what can be done, given the size of the National Guard and the size of our reserve component, that if these requirements are out there and that we can properly plan for them, that we can lessen the impact on employers and on families through increased emphasis on volunteerism. The Air Guard and what they're doing is a great example of this. On the other hand, if we come in with and use this involuntary process that I mentioned, the Presidential Selected Reserve call-up, and we do it with less than judicious process and thought, I think you can have negative impacts, and I think you can end up with a situation that will severely lessen our ability to recruit and retain individuals. I'm pleased to tell you at this point in time that we are not seeing that we are able to manage through the situation as it has been presented to us to date since the end of Desert Shield and Desert Storm. But it is something we are concerned about and we continue to watch closely.
General Rees, my name is Monroe Sweetland. I'm a member of the club. I think the militia have a legendary role in American history, important part of American patriotism. They have many credits, but now a new cloud, it seems to me, has confused the situation. I think this is a very welcome program to me because I didn't, even though after service in the Oregon legislature, lifetime in and out of Oregon, I don't know much about the National Guard. This has been very informative. I have one short question. Does the governor and the state legislature of Oregon still retain any kind of sovereignty or control over it? And second, do you have any kind of approach, I don't know what you would call it, to the American public, to the Oregon public particularly, to discourage the formation of independent, self-starting, shoot-'em-up so-called militias, which have considerably tarnished, if I may say so, the good tradition and name of the militia. But in Texas, certainly in Idaho, in Montana, Michigan, number of places, just in the last year or two, we've had a serious erosion of the meaning of the word militia in the minds of the people. Couldn't there be a public relations program of some kind through your organizations, through the state of Oregon, that would do what you're trying to do here today?
Well, thank you. Those are great questions. I really appreciate you bringing them up. If there is a concern about this business of does the militia belong to the governor, or is it a part of the federal force, and there is this balance that we need to be concerned about. I particularly am convinced, partly because I have a background as a lawyer, that the laws are in place and there is a proper balance, that in peacetime the governor, under what we call Title 32 of the U.S. Code and certainly under the Constitution, is the commander of the National Guard. On the other hand, many of the barriers to calling people to federal service have dropped off over time, and a lot of them have had to do with the exigencies of the Cold War and wanting to be able to respond quickly. And in fact, one of the elements that is in there is this Presidential Selected Reserve call-up, the authority to call 200,000 members of the Guard and the Reserve The president's, all he's got to do is declare an emergency, say it meets certain criteria, and he can call these individuals at the signing of or the movement of the pen. Now, there are elements within that law that require the president to report to the Congress, and certain things have to take place within a certain number of days, or the Congress should take action to cut off funding, to limit what goes on, and to recall those troops. Now, this gets back to this debate about the balance between the president and the Congress. So far, that balance in the current events in Bosnia and so on have not generated any kind of conflict. In fact, the Congress seems to be in support of what the president's doing. When it gets to the governor, the federal requirement is preeminent over the governor's right to say, I want the militia to stay here. And actually, this question, if we go back well more than 100 years ago, has already been decided in law, and I don't see any reversal of that at all. There's only one place in recent legislation in the last 10 years where the governor, by virtue of an emergency in the state, can say, time out, I do not want these troops to leave because we've got a flood or an earthquake, or I have an insurrection or something going on in Oregon. I need these troops to stay here. He has the right under federal law to stop that from happening. Now, to go to the second question, which is this business of the so-called citizen militias that are out there that you've mentioned, it is appalling. It is a real problem. It is something that I have a great deal of problem with, and I know that the soldiers and airmen of the Oregon Guard, and I'm sure all of the other National Guards of the United States, who have a great deal of pride in having this legacy of this 361 years of militia service, to have individuals who are not part of the well-regulated militia that we're talking about out creating their own outlaw organizations. Fortunately, there is a statute in Oregon on the books that allows for the enforcement of, I will say, the corralling of these outlaw militias. I can't cite you the statute right now, but I'm very comfortable that Oregon is in a position that if it needs to take action, it can do that. When it comes to the public relations piece, I think it's important that individuals in my position are able to articulate the difference between outlaw militias and the well-regulated militia, and to speak up for this great legacy and heritage that we have. And certainly it's a pleasure to see former editors and current editors of our news media here today so that they can help us carry that message.
My name is Mike Katz. I'm a member of the club. General Rees, I understand, I think, that no one presently serving abroad in harm's way, either in the regular Army, in the reserves, or in the National Guard, is doing so involuntarily. That is, they all joined up voluntarily. How do you account for, and what is your reaction to what to some people seems an unseemly amount of whining by people who are paid and voluntarily submit themselves for the duty when they come back to file claims for phantom illnesses, perhaps, or all kinds of disorders, and make the rest of us feel as if somehow or other we've abused them, when in fact I think we're paying them to do the job. They don't have to do it if they don't want to.
Good question. Yes, clearly, from 1973 on, there has been no draft. We have a very successful all-volunteer force. I cannot deny at all that we are not well paid, although I'm sure that comes up periodically within the Congress, that this should be adjusted. Truly, it would appear, again, we have this business of balance in reporting. What is the information that we have about the particular situation? I'll give you an example. When we call or we ask these individuals, the 400 members of the 142nd, to go, or other organizations that have been called out of the Guard, it seems like there's always somewhere they find some individual in that group who says something along the lines of, "I never thought this would happen. You know, I signed up, I took the bonus, I went to college on the GI Bill," whatever it is, "but I never thought this would happen." You know, there's those kind of events happen in life, I guess, and somehow the news media seems to find that individual because it's an interesting thing. At least it's controversial, and we can get some coverage on it. That is kind of an erratic out there that I can't deal with, but that's just a fact of life. Now, I think you're talking about this Gulf War syndrome. Is that among other things? Okay. Well, first of all, on the Gulf War syndrome, this to me is a great mystery, but there appears to be enough truth to the fact that this has happened not only to reservists and National Guardsmen, but to active duty individuals, and widespread enough that the Department of Defense and the Congress have responded, and I guess the best way to describe it is they have declared that it is a fact, and they are going to address the situation. And as far as I know, compensation, veterans' rights, and so on, all now include recording the individuals, their family members, and so on, who seem to have these afflictions, and they continue to track this, and we see this now as part of a recognized malady that the Veterans Administration is treating. Now, if you come to other issues that are out there, I think some of it, such as the POW-MIA thing, there's some aspect of this is political, that there are those folks who are never going to accept the fact that this happened 25 years ago, 30 years ago, 35 years ago. And there are those people who are going to, shall we say, embrace that individual and that concept because it garners certain political resonance out there. And I think that's unfortunate. I think there is a time, in my personal opinion, that these things need to come to rest because there is nothing humanly possible to continue to do about these situations. I hope that answers your question. Sir.
Bob Wheel, member. As a reserve Army officer in the Second World War, I have some recollections of the readiness or lack of readiness of the National Guard, the qualifications or lack of qualifications of the officers in the National Guard, and somewhat strained relationship between the West Pointers and the National Guard officers. Would you reassure me that things look better in Oregon?
Oh, yes, absolutely. As a West Pointer and a National Guardsman, I can assure you that we are meeting all the standards of the active component, and certainly, as been alluded to here earlier, the influence of the federal government in this is very pronounced. There is now a requirement, if we just want to look at credentials, that every officer in the National Guard must have a college degree. Every officer in the National Guard must meet all professional military education requirements. I cannot find any difference between the Army or Air Force Guardsmen, the officers there, or in the Army or Air Force Reserve, and the active component. Everybody is educated the same way. Many people are, you are expected to have similar career experiences for advancement. I am very, very proud to say that people are across the board meeting standards.
I want to ask you.
Okay.
One more question.
All right.
If I can ask one more, John Leeper,
No,
one
I'm
more
not
time.
bringing it to an end. I was actually going to ask a question.
Oh,
myself.
pardon me.
But go to it. Go to it. Oh, and please do it. Please come up afterwards. My first question is simple and probably simplistic, and that is, I'm curious to know where all the numbers come from, like the 101st and the 82nd, and where does one begin, and how do you I'm curious to know about that. And secondly, I wanted to know what the obligation legally is of employers of these people who leave Oregon for 5 months. Must they hold their jobs for them?
Well, first of all, there is an organization called the Institute for Military Heraldry, which has all of this information, and I'm afraid I couldn't do it justice, but simply put, they try to maintain what they call lineage and honors for every military organization. And so if you were in 1636, if they created one of these regiments in Massachusetts, they would try through their record keeping and to maintain the name and this history of this organization, and even if it went out of business and went into some kind of inactive status and were resurrected, so to speak, later on and called to the colors, that you would again bring its history forward. So all of these things are tied into that. Now, what was the second question?
The obligation of
the obligation of employers. All right. This is one of the things that I think has really reached maturity in the last 25 years. Those of you that are World War II veterans and so on are very familiar with what was known as the Soldiers and Sailors Civil Relief Act. This was a very important piece of legislation back in World War II about people being called to the colors and knowing that their farms and their businesses couldn't be taken away, that their loans and so on, that they were obligated to take care of, that in fact there was a continuation, that when you returned home you could get back in step and you could resume your civil life. Well, with the advent of the total force, this became much, much more important, and a lot of emphasis then in the last 25 years, since 1973, has been put into these laws. And in fact, it's become paramount in our ability to, when we talk about recruiting and retaining people in our organizations, to be able to tell them that no matter what you do here, you have what we call re-employment rights, that you are able to come back from whatever you're doing, come back into your organization as though you never left. So if your seniority were to increase, the benefits were to increase based on where you were in that organization, it is as though you never left. So this is an important piece of our ability to do this, do these missions all around the world, and it is an important part of our relationships with our employers out there, that people in my role, people such as Fred Rosenbaum, and I mentioned earlier, who is the head of our state committee for an organization called Employer Support of the Guard and Reserve, that we go out and we work with employers and we reduce conflicts and we do education and we try to make it as painless as possible for employers to deal with soldiers and airmen and whatever their deployments and their obligations may be. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Okay. Sir.
I apologize, Fran. John Leeper again. General, are there any inhibitions on the part of, I don't know, educational institutions or otherwise that discourage you as a reserve component from enlisting persons for your forces?
Yes, sir. We currently have an issue here in Portland where we cannot recruit in the Portland School District in any of the institutions here, any of the high schools. This poses a real dilemma for me, particularly from a public policy perspective, because I am required to see to it that the Oregon National Guard represents our communities. And I'm talking about diversity here, and if I look at the demographic breakup of the state of Oregon, or the makeup of the state of Oregon, that truly, if I am to meet those public policy goals, that this is the place that I need to be looking to bring minority members into the Oregon National Guard. And so here's a situation where, number one, we have this policy that I think has great merit. Secondly, that the Guard, whether it be Army or Air, has, I think, great opportunities to allow individuals to find trades, get an education, learn about self-discipline, learn about public service and so on, but I can't reach those individuals because of this prohibition. So it is bothersome, it is a dilemma for us in the Oregon Guard, and I hope at some point in time that we can come to some agreement as to how we can reach those individuals that want to serve.
Is the Portland public school system the only one that imposes that as a restriction?
It's, to my knowledge, the Portland school system is the only one that does that.
Excuse me. Major General Rees, when the 142nd comes home, what can they claim to have accomplished? I understand the mission, but when they come home, what can they claim to have accomplished?
Well, let me talk about that on two levels. First of all, on this national level, they were called to enforce this no-fly zone. They represented the United Nations in enforcing this no-fly zone. They demonstrated their professional competence to get that job done. On a lower level, on the level of the unit, this particular organization has been an air defense unit for nearly 50 years, meaning that they have been here with the idea that the Russians are coming over the North Pole with their bombers or some kind of a threat during the Cold War, and these people, their primary thing was to be out there on alert, scramble, and go up and take care of these Russian bombers. That particular event, thank God, never transpired. That mission has gone away. They have been changing into what's known as a general purpose unit, and they have had minor deployments to Panama, to Iceland, relatively benign situations, and what they are able to now come back and say to themselves, we met the test, we are professionals that can deploy, can meet the needs of the nation. And so I think their cohesiveness, their confidence in their ability, and their confidence in their leadership is going to be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much for speaking with us today and informing us about something that I'm sure many of us knew little to nothing about. I've been able to add dust up to my vocabulary, and wonderful new term, and know that I speak in behalf of all of you and of the members of the club in thanking you so much for coming and informing us about the National Guard. Thank you very much, and we stand adjourned. Your first question was,